The West understands this, that India cannot overnight wean itself away. Similarly, India has not condemned the Ukraine invasion outright in this forlorn hope of harking back to some Indo-Soviet honeymoon period.
Maybe Prime Minister would rub US in the wrong way when such a big war is going on. He looked quite emotional with Zelensky.
The West understands that India has had a very strong relationship with the Soviet Union, was a message to the West that India is not Putin's puppet, that we can do what we want and we will meet who we want and when we want. For example, coming from my own field of work, Iranian studies primarily, Washington and Tehran are at loggerheads since 1979, but India has had a very stable relationship with Iran as one of the few West Asian partners and as a Muslim republic. And India has, of course, had to accede to the sanctions which were imposed after 2006. It fell into place, okay. But at the same time, India did not dial down its relationship with Tehran.
That it is just one person who can broker a deal and can end the war. Hello and welcome. You are watching Oneindia. My name is Nagin Singh. Today we are joined by Burzine Waghmar, SOAS South Asia Institute, University of London, and we are going to discuss the trip that PM Modi made to Russia, to Ukraine, and what it means for India and for the rest of world. Thank you so much, Mr. Waghmar, to connect with us. The first question that I want to ask you that how does the world views what PM Modi did in the last few weeks? He traveled to meet Putin. He also traveled to Ukraine to meet Zelensky. Now, both these meeting together, how would the world see it?
When you say the world, primarily you mean how the West sees it, who have become increasingly India's allies, and not so much allies, but actually partners, economic and political and defense partners, with India joining the Quad in recent years, as you know. Um, Primarily, India enjoys an expansive set of multivalent relationships with several countries. Now, inevitably, in so doing, whether in the past or in the present, India ends up upsetting some and pleasing others. And there's no getting around that in foreign policy, which is a common bane of all countries. So India is not an exception to it. What
Right.
West and Washington does understand, and primarily Indians don't understand this, but Washington does appreciate, even if they don't say so publicly, but privately, that India cannot overnight wean itself away from Russian supplies of defense equipment on which it has depended for more than a quarter of a century. It is
Right.
happening as we speak, and since 2018, Ms. Singh, you will notice that India's defense imports, for the first time since 2018, dipped below 50% from Moscow as its principal supplier. It has
Right.
expanded into not just indigenous equipment ramping up with Mahindra Aerospace and other aerospace and others, but also with purchases from the French, the Rafale jets, as you recently know,
Yeah.
and from Washington and others in the West, and Israel, of course. So that is happening. But be that as it may, the West understands this, that India cannot overnight wean itself away. And it also understands, and it does give India wide berth and breathing space because of the China factor. And
Yeah.
Washington has been primarily sympathetic about it and has overlooked aspects when it has criticized others, but not criticized India as such. So that must be seen in one context. And also, Modi's first trip upon assumption of office after elections was to Moscow. And you could say that was also largely symbolic to assure that Moscow and New Delhi are on the same page. And of course,
Right.
it was a boost to Putin's PR because even as Mr. Modi landed in Moscow, the NATO summit was ongoing where Ukraine was condemned.
Yeah.
And that may be so. And India was, as I said, it demonstrates how it maintains an expansive set of relationships which may seem conflicting or contradictory to others, but not to India. Mr. Modi was in Moscow in July. Come August 23rd, he's in Kiev. Now, that may seem a volte-face to some, but in the Indian context of things, at least to me as a historian, it doesn't seem so because India does behave like this, which may be considered ambivalent, perplexing, or irritating. I'll just one example to talk about recent history. India's actions when the Kuwait crisis took place in August 1990. Foreign
yeah,
Minister Gujral was the only one to meet Saddam Hussein and was given a one-to-one meeting. And India's immediate interests were in order to get Indian expatriates out of Kuwait, who were running into their thousands. And of
mhm,
course, the Kuwaitis and the other GCC members were rather upset that Gujral not only made it to Baghdad, but was seen very warmly hugging and conversing with Saddam Hussein, who was condemned by all in the West and of course in the Arab world.
mhm,
Now it's a slightly different situation, but you get my point that India took a bold move at that time and a rather audacious move to send a foreign minister, but it had its primary interests in mind at that time. And of course, India did not join the coalition for the Gulf War in February
yeah,
91 too. Similarly, India has not condemned the Ukraine invasion outright, but at the same time, it has also not 3 months ago, uh, okayed the final peace communique, which was inked in Switzerland by President Zelensky and others on the Ukraine Peace Summit. Of course, Deputy National Security Advisor Pavan Kapoor was sent and a delegation was sent from India, but that didn't add
mhm,
up to much. And the world would have wanted to see India take a more robust stance on it. But as I
right,
mentioned to you, Washington and London understand because of not pushing India, at the same time seeing that Putin is not pushed too much into the Chinese camp. But that brings me to
mhm,
my next point. There is this
right,
belief in certain New Delhi circles that if India can blow hot, blow cold with both partners, somehow Putin will not be pushed into Beijing's camp. Actually, I'm sorry to disappoint one and all by telling you it has already happened. With each increasing day, as the war has started, uh, China has practically access to all of Siberian oil and natural gas reserves. And Putin has
yeah,
been more than willing to sign that off with the pipeline deals to Beijing. And that is happening because China is also a major importer. It's not just Indians who are purchasing Russian oil in copious quantities. And Putin leans very heavily on Beijing, which has not supplied combative equipment, but supplementary equipment, defense equipment, has been supplied to Moscow since the war began in February 22. And also, Russia is increasingly indebted to China economically. It is a completely
yeah,
lopsided relationship in terms of trade deficit. So all that
yeah,
has happened and the ship has sailed. So I don't understand why Indians keep going on about the fact that we must see to that we don't push Moscow into Beijing's camp when it already is. And Mr. Singh, I have something more disturbing to tell you, again as a historian. If you remember, in November 86, when Gorbachev made his first state visit after assuming office a year earlier, as Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's guest.
yeah,
Following that visit, on the last day of the press conference, Mr. Gorbachev made it quite clear, and this was the USSR, this is not Russia, which panned out a few years later when the dissolution of the Soviet Union occurred. This was the
mhm,
USSR, I repeat, Mr. Singh, the USSR and Premier Gorbachev, who made it clear to a press conference of Indian journalists in any future Sino Indian showdown, Moscow cannot be counted upon for any assistance. Do not
mhm,
expect anything from us. And it seems people have forgotten this aspect. Gorbachev made
right,
this clear when Indo-USSR relations were at their very peak. Uh,
right,
and they never have been quite since after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. They have been quite stable, you can say, Indo-Russian relations, true, but it's not quite what it was during the Indo-USSR period when India depended very heavily on Moscow for the UN veto on Kashmir and other matters, but also for defense equipment and trade and the like. But Gorbachev could say point blank to India on his last day's visit. And what happened after 86 was that the Sino USSR frontier border agreement was being worked upon and came into effect because China didn't just have a border war with India in 62, it had a border war with the USSR in 69, which people forget, in the Soviet Far East. And it had
right,
never been arbitrary, it had never really been demarcated, and Gorbachev was determined to get that going. And it finally
mhm,
came out in the early 90s, and the Sino Russian frontier is now settled. It's only the Sino-Indian border that is a question
Yeah.
of acrimony, because China has pretty much arranged border agreements with 12 to 15 other states. It's only the India problem, India imbroglio, which remains as such. So this is to point out to you that in this forlorn hope of harking back to some Indo-Soviet honeymoon period, as certain Indian left intellectuals, journalists, and even diplomats keep talking about, Moscow will not come to your assistance, whether the Ukraine war took place or not, whether Russia invaded Georgia or not. This is a different dynamic, and Moscow made it plain. And Putin is exactly going to follow what Gorbachev did. Why would he stick his nose out for you, particularly when he is in hock to Beijing? It's not happening. And the sooner Indians wake up and smell the coffee, the better.
But the situations might have changed a bit. When we see Prime Minister Narendra Modi hugging Putin, which rarely happens that someone is hugging Putin. So we want to understand from you that how the situations have changed after Prime Minister Narendra Modi has come. We want to understand that maybe the Western powers, of course, USA being the leaders of those Western powers or leading the NATO, how they would see it. Are they seeing it that maybe Prime Minister would rub US in the wrong way when such a big war is going on, so much of aid is being transferred from USA to Ukraine? So at that moment, how would they read Prime Minister Modi? Of course, so many images with Ukrainian president also came out, where he looked quite emotional with Zelensky. So both these things that have happened in this week, will that rub you as in a different manner? Of course, we have talked about the past and the strategies that they had, but I'm also talking about the on personal level, how the world leaders, especially USA, how are they going to react to it? And
Uh,
elections are there, so there could be a difference as well.
well, insofar as Washington and London were concerned, with the Moscow visit in July, aid was familiar fare to them. Yes, they did make some noises about it, that it's regrettable. They were not outright condemnatory, but they did express their displeasure, not to tell India what it can or cannot do, but it's just that when you're the world's largest democracy after 77 years and you run a transparent polity based on adult franchise, not a repressive regime which just locks up people arbitrarily, which is happening in Putin's Russia today, which is a throwback to the Soviet Union, you would expect, and that is what I think Indians don't get, is that they would like some vocal movement on the part of Delhi to at least condemn the invasion, in that you are a democracy, you're not just any country, because India always says that it's exceptional. And the Indian pursuit of foreign policy has always been based on its exceptional status as a country, based on its non-alignment, that it will always tell others what it thinks, whether they are friends or allies, because things must be based on principles. So it's a question of right versus wrong and right versus might. You can't just walk into a country and take it over. Just as, like I said, Iraq happened with Kuwait, and
Yeah.
Putin just happened with Ukraine, which has been a sovereign, de jure, de facto independent entity for the last 30 plus years, along with other 14 republics of the USSR, which went their separate ways. Now, Mr. Putin has his own historical baggage because he has never forgiven the end of the Cold War, and he feels Russia's prominence was eclipsed by the West, and that the West wasn't. Putin's psychology is this, Miss Singh. From what we hear in London and what some Russian experts tell me, it's not that he's upset that the West has accused or criticized Russia or gone against it, whether in Kosovo or other actions. His problem is the West has ignored Russia. And that for him is a greater humiliation and slight. The sense of as if we don't matter. That is what really gets him. It's not that the West has criticized Russia or not criticized Russia. It's just that it feels that Russia is just bypassed in major decisions, which explains Putin's psychology and actions in Georgia, in Syria, in Ukraine, and in Serbia during the late 90s. But putting that aside,
And
the West understands that India has had a very strong relationship with the Soviet Union, despite, and it also understands that India is not a client state of Russia. It never has been, which must lead you and others to then ask if Mr. Modi can hug Putin in the middle of this war uh, in July, but then Mr. Modi hugs practically so many other statesmen of the world. So what's so exceptional is what I would ask in the first place. And why would people make so much capital about it? But then the second point is, in a month's time, Moscow was slightly taken aback because Mr. Modi lands up in Kiev. What does it tell you? That India will do what it feels, and goes back to this Indian mentality of strategic autonomy, and that we will meet and shake hands with who we want. You can't tell us what we can do or cannot do. And this was a message. This visit to Kiev was a message to the West that India is not Putin's puppet. That we can do what we want, and we will meet who we want and when we want. For example, coming from my own field of work, Iranian studies primarily,
Right.
Washington and Tehran are at loggerheads since 1979, but India has had a very stable relationship with Iran as one of the few West Asian partners and as a Muslim republic. And India has, of course, had to accede to the sanctions which were imposed after 2006. It fell into place, okay. But at the same time, India did not dial down its relationship with Tehran just because Washington has a problem with it. And India could stand up to Washington that uh, we can maintain relationships with others who may fight among themselves. So that's what happened with the Kiev visit.
Okay, but I understand your point in that way. But just focusing on Modi, of course, we are talking about the Indian perspective over here. So we have heard several statements, from international leaders as well, not just now, but also in the past, that it is just one person who can broker a deal and can end the war. Many have said that, Narendra Modi has good relations there. He has good relations with the US as well. Of course, he went to meet Zelensky as well. But I just want to understand from you that those who many who are banking that Narendra Modi, being the Indian PM, he can have some role in warring factions, that he can stop the war, or there is a good reason that you see, that is there any reason that you can tell us that what will be the points that make India stronger, or there is a possibility that Modi can play a role in stopping this big war which is going on for 2 years, like Jordan is trying quite hard in Middle East to stop the war between Israel and Hamas. So can Modi have some similar role, that he can bring both parties on the same table? Because it is not being able to be done. They try to do it in Switzerland. They try to have a peace talk over there, but Putin outrightly said that he will not attend it.
India cannot play a role. It's as simple as that. The Jordanian example is instructive, and I'm glad you brought that up. But therein is one different proviso in that Jordan is seriously involved for its own security and embattled relationship tied in with the Arab world and Israel on one side. India has no stake in the Caucasus. It has relations, which is all very well, but it has no direct stake in the matter. And India's intervention or China's intervention, which carries greater heft than India, does not matter to Putin because it's very personal. It has come down to an ethnic fratricidal conflict, which in any case it was even at the very outset, and it's personal with Putin. Uh, just as it was personal between Hitler and Stalin, there's the personal dimension where he has staked his entire career on this, and it's clearly blowing up in Putin's face, whether one likes to believe it or not. The point
Mhm.
is, Ukraine is still standing despite being battered and bruised. It has not caved in, and it's not over in a matter of weeks, which is what Putin boasted to Xi Jinping just after the Winter Olympics had finished, if you remember. And clearly, China looks back also that and knows, even if it doesn't say so, and did not say so to Putin when they had the last summit in May, when Putin came into Beijing, that things are not going well. And even the Chinese privately ask themselves, although they publicly don't condemn Putin and Moscow, as India doesn't, as to what is the end game and what is the purpose of this all. That is the similar question which is being asked in South Bloc too, I'm sure, by Indian diplomats. And they must realize that this is just one man's obsession with Ukraine. It is Putin's. It is not Russia's war. It is not a war that the Russian people asked for or sought, which explains why the Russian economy may still be stabilized, but at least 30 to 40,000 Russian emigres, the best of Russia's brain drain talent, has gone off to Argentina, Turkey, Israel, and so on and so forth, because they don't want to be conscripted into this war. If it was Russia's war, you have to explain to me why are these Russians all abroad? And of course, the question is, why are Indians being captured and found dead also as being pressed into the fight, as we have seen in recent times? And the Indian Foreign Office has, and Mr. Modi brought it up in July, and some
Right.
bodies, I believe, have to return back because they were lured into the pretext of going as expatriates, as if they were going to work in
Okay.
Bahrain or Dubai. And the next thing you know, they're forcibly put into a uniform, which, what does it show you if not Russia's desperate tactic? So I don't
Hmm.
see India, and in fact, India did bring up something with Mr. Putin on that last month, but nothing really much has happened because some people have been dead of those 7 or 8 Indians recently from Haryana, and their bodies have not even come back yet. So I don't see anything quite yet happening, or India playing, having a substantial role to play in diffusing the situation. It There is talk of it happening, and has been so since the war began, as one of Moscow's closest allies. But India has never really had that sort of relationship where it could have leverage with Moscow to tell it what to do. It has never been that sort of relationship. It has purely been a defense and economic relationship, and partly political during the Soviet Union days
Right.
when it used the veto to help India for Kashmir and other matters. But otherwise, even Moscow has realized, uh, Russia has realized that India is slowly going in the Western camp. And of course, they don't say much about it because they still want to be in India's good books, just as India tries to be in Moscow's good books and not try to push it too much into the Chinese camp. So it's a question of hedging and leverage all the time. And such is the nature of murky politics.
Okay, but still, last question. Actually, I think we are running out of time, so I'll ask you last question. Let's summarize it in 2 minutes. My question is that this current trip, how PM Modi would have seen it, what kind of benefits that it would, have, of course, on PM Modi's image, that he is a leader who is, reachable by both countries. And Zelensky has, anyway, so many times has said that you should talk to Putin and you should try to get a resolve of this. So overall, just give me an idea that the both trips, how is this going to impact PM Modi's figure in the world, and of course in Asia, in Middle East, of course.
The visit is seen largely symbolic, that the world's largest democracy can maintain communications open lines with both antagonists. That's the first thing that can be said. Now, what you make of the trip subsequently is a different matter altogether, in that it is largely symbolic, and it just goes to show that India can demonstrate some empathy with the Ukrainian situation, even though it has not condemned Moscow outright for the invasion. Incidentally, India has sent more than 100 tons of medical humanitarian equipment to Kiev since the war began. That must also be placed on record. And that has all been shipped via Poland, just as Mr. Modi took the train from Poland to Kiev. So India has done symbolically that bit as well. And of course, prior to the invasion, you must remember that Ukraine supplied 77.8% of India's edible oil imports. Edible oil, because the Indian edible oil industry has never been one that has been well set up, and India still largely depends on oil imports, not just of the hydrocarbon sort, but also the edible sort from abroad. And Ukraine's sunflower oil was a key supplier to India. And that stopped. And so overnight that stopped and created problems with food security issues for India, but also for the rest of the developing world. And it's interesting to note on that point, Mr. Singh, that a few months after the war began, this is around April or June 22, people said that this was primarily an ethnic conflict between two former Soviet cousins or Slavic cousins and that sort of thing, and it's a white man's war. It doesn't affect us, but it does affect the world in more ways than one. It has world war ramifications in that the economies of India, Egypt and others have gone to spiral with their balance of payments. Bangladesh, too, incidentally, which is looking for a IMF bailout this month, had undertook a lot of issues, had to endure a lot with the balance of payments crisis once the Ukraine war began. So it must be realized that the global south does have a stake, although it likes to dismiss the matter and say that this is purely a white man's war and has no direct effect on us. It does, as I've pointed out, with all these ramifications that show up in more ways than one. And last example, the diamond industry in Bombay and Surat, and Navsari, if you know. Diamond dealers in Bombay are tearing their hair out now because of the new sanctions that have come in for Russian diamonds from Siberian mines. And they have to make sure there's a traceability factor, whether it comes from South African mines or from Russian mines. And this new slew of legislation has thrown so many of them overboard overnight. So
Right.
that's just take one example from Bombay. So I end with that so that people don't in India think that the Ukraine war has nothing to do with us. Go to Saveri
Yeah.
Bazaar, Bombay, and ask them what they are enduring, and they will tell you how the war so far away is having effects on them. Thank you.
I'm so glad you could bring in all angles, that too of Javeri Bazaar. Thank you so much for your time and giving us these insights. We really appreciate it. And of course, we'll be speaking with you again on some other topics and we'll connect again. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you.
Don't miss out. Log on to oneindia.com for more updates.